Il microfono è acceso? Angela, il microfono è acceso. Okay. So good evening and welcome. I'm Maria Bonaria Urban, and I'm the Director of Study in History at the Royal Netherlands Institute in Rome, the KNIR. And it's a great pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the KNIR staff to this second research dialogue of the year. As you probably know, the KNIR Research Dialogues are a lecture and discussion series in which international scholars present their research about topics related to our Institute core research themes and areas. And this academic year, our Research Dialogues program focuses on colonialism, and it's in both in presence and in live streaming. So we are very happy that we can hold this Research Dialogues series in our auditorium, but of course, a cordial welcome to those who are connected with us remotely. So welcome everyone also on the screen. And of course, a cordial welcome and many thanks to our guest of today, Dr. Beatrice Falcucci, for kindly accepting our invitation. And I'm honored to welcome you today, and it's a great pleasure to learn more about your fascinating research on colonial collections in Italy. Before introducing Dr. Falcucci, I would like to give some information on the program of today. After Dr. Falcucci talk, we will have plenty of time for the discussion. And for those in the auditorium, if you have a question, we will bring you a microphone. And for those following the event online, please switch off your camera during the presentation. And after that, you can switch it on again. For the moment, no one has the camera on, so there is no problem. And of course, if you wish to ask a question, you can use the option raise hand, or you can write your question in the chat and I will keep an eye on it. And now it's a great pleasure for me to introduce our guest. Beatrice Falcucci gained her PhD in History of Science at the University of Florence after completing her research into the colonial collections in Italian museums. And currently she's a member of the Fondazione Luigi Einaudi Torino and an Italian fellow at the American Academy in Rome. She has published several articles on this topic, such as Il Museo Coloniale di Roma, tra propaganda imperiale, oblio e riallestimento, and Bring the Empire to the Provinces, Colonial Museums and Colonial Knowledge in Fascist Italy. And she also co-edited Africa all'acqua di rosa, I diari delle missioni in cirenaica del 1928-1929 of Nello Puccioni. Today, Dr. Falcucci will talk on her research into some of these Italian colonial collections, focusing on the differences between the 19th century and the 20th century collections. The title of our presentation is Italian Colonial Museums and Collections Between History, Memory, and Today's Challenges. So please, Beatrice, the floor is yours.
So thank you, Maria Bonaria, for inviting me to this KNIR dialogue and for giving me the opportunity to talk about my research. It's a great honor. My presentation makes no claim to be able to exhaust a topic such as colonial museology in 40 minutes, of course. And as will be obvious, I don't have answers to many of the questions I ask. But I hope it will be an opportunity for reflection. It certainly is for me. And I hope that during the discussion, we will be able to go into some aspects in greater depth. Your comments and thoughts are very valuable to me. Anyway, I won't waste any more time and start with my presentation. The history of exhibition has been a subject of renewed interest in recent decades, as the very notion of exhibition a concept itself in constant evolution with its virtual and digital meanings, has come to be regarded as one of the fundamental traits of the so-called modernity. In the field of European museology, scholarly debate has focused especially on museums with a heavy colonial heritage and on their decision to return or retain certain artifacts. In this paper, we'll see as the colonial collection in Italy displaying ethnographic artifacts alongside specimens of natural history and commodity products provided comforting ideas of supremacy and control. There are more than 19 colonial collections in Italy, in army museums, natural history museums, anthropology and ethnology museums, missionary museums, and so on. After a brief introduction, I will focus on two case studies in particular. One representative of the liberal era and one representative of the fascist era. The Museo di Antropologia e Etnologia in Florence and the Museo Coloniale Maria Fioroni in Leniago, a small city close to Verona. Through them, the Italian colonies came to be understood by people less as something out there, and instead came to have a palpable material presence all over Italy. Through objects, visitors were able to glean information, we'll see of what kind, about diverse people's culture and climates, make assumptions about their relative positions in social evolutionary hierarchies, and justify their own political and economical subjugation of such people, shaping the colonial consciousness of the Italians beyond the fall of the fascist regime. The museum period has been described as extending from the 1840s to 1890s, a time in which museums were intended as institutions devoted to the collection, preservation, exhibition, study, and interpretation of material objects. Converging with the pedagogical theory of object-based learning, museums offered visitors textual material experiences. Characteristically, these objects of material culture were the objects of others, of human beings, whose similarity or difference was experienced by alien observers, mostly European. Natural history museums from the 18th century onwards displayed specimens of flora and fauna and of arts and crafts, often with mummies and skulls and other bits of pieces of human bodies. The British Museum gained treasures ranging from the Indian diamond to the bronze of Benin, and the Louvre galleries objects collected by Napoleon in Egypt. The museum was proclaimed both as an instrument to serve the collective good of the state, to educate the masses in culture and history through the exposure of objects, and a tool of the disciplinary society. In Italy, the emergence of the nation state, the colonial enterprise, and the creation of a unitarian identity and culture in the second half of the 19th century were intimately bound together. Museums, along with other public institutions, were key sites where new ways of thinking about public culture flourished. Museums, memorial centers, and other heritage sites have traditionally relied on the use of physical artifacts to provide visitors with an experience of authenticity. The aim was, and still is, to trigger people's imagination and to evoke an emotional response that serves to elicit empathy and moral engagement with historical events and actors portrayed. As Benedict Anderson pointed out, thinking of oneself as a member of a national public, envisaged as a large family or community, but made up of thousands or millions of people, most of whom one will never meet, is an impressive feat of the imagination. Moreover, the possession of artifacts from other cultures was in itself important because for imperialist nation, such objects were physical symbols of a capacity to rule and master beyond their national borders. Francesco Cassata and Claudio Pogliano believed that the polycentrism and the mosaic nature of the new Italian nation that came into being in the last decades of the 19th century determined its national character, highlighting Quintino Sella's failed project of verticalism, which focused resources on the capital in order to make it the scientific fulcrum of Italy, and was met with resistance from other cultural centers across the peninsula. Even during fascism, despite the strong desire to centralize cultural assets, which already characterized the Legge di Tutela of 1909 and was confirmed with the so-called Legge Bottai of 1939, regulating cultural heritage, an indispensable element for the Duce cultural policies, the regime had to settle with polycentrism. For the Italian case studies, this phenomenon of nation building following Italian unification is closely intertwined with the start of colonial expansion. Italy had arrived late to the so-called colonial race, and its status as the least of the great powers, a position of relative weakness in international affairs, meant that it was dependent on the acquiescence of Britain, France, and Germany toward its empire building. In 1882, the Bay of Assab on the Red Sea, previously owned by an Italian navigation company, was taken over by the Italian government, becoming Italy's first overseas territory. Italy's search for colonies continued until February 1886, when by a secret agreement with Britain, it annexed the port of Massawa in Eritrea from the crumbling Ottoman Empire. At the same time, Italy occupied territory on the south side of the Horn of Africa, forming what would become Italian Somaliland. The fascist government that came to power with Benito Mussolini in 1922 sought to increase the size of the Italian empire and to satisfy the claims of Italian irredentists. Among the regime's goals were the acquisition of territory considered historically Italian, let's say, in France, like Nice, and in Yugoslavia, Dalmatia. The expansion of Italy's sphere of influence into the Balkans and the acquisition of more colonies in Africa, a process that would come to fulfillment in 1935 with the invasion of Ethiopia. Precisely during the 1920s, as the pacification of Libya progressed and fascism organized its line of expansion across the rest of the continent, an acceleration in the creation and dissemination of a coherent exotic Africa imagery happened. The circulation of books, films, but also comics and graphic novels, commercial advertisements, fashion and design, decorative objects, posters, photographs, trading cards, toys and games, illustrated journals and prints on African themes increased considerably. And mass-produced materials helped building the consensus around the colonial conquest. In the 1930s, in Cirenaica, 10,000 Libyans were relocated and their land was given to Italian settlers. They were also forced to march across the desert into concentration camps. In both 1932 and 1935, Italy demanded to the League of Nations mandate on the former German Cameroon and a free hand in Ethiopia from France in return for Italian support against Germany. In its second invasion of Ethiopia in 1935 and 1936, Italy was successful and it merged its new conquest with its older East African colonies to create Italian East Africa. During the Second Italo-Ethiopian War, Italian violations of the laws of war were reported and documented. These included the use of chemical weapons such as mustard gas, the use of concentration camp in counterinsurgency, and attacks on the Red Cross facilities. In the final years of the 19th century, many private collections of commercial and geographical societies, such as the Museum of the Società Africana d'Italia in Napoli, or the collections of the Società Italiana di Esplorazione Commerciale in Milano, were displayed during exhibitions such as the Esposizione Generale in Torino in 1884, the Esposizione di Palermo in 1891, and the Manifestazione Coloniale in Genoa in 1895. Some of those expositions included living ethno-exhibitions, usually called Villaggio Indigeno or Villaggio Eritreo. which put humans just like objects and animals on display without any questions on such practice being risen. Just a side note, this continued to happen until at least the Expo of 1958 in Belgium. Following the lead of the great exhibition at London Crystal Palace in 1851, where the Koh-i-Noor diamond, symbol of the successful conquest of India, was exhibited, and the Exposition Universelle in Paris in 1867, with its famous Turkish souk. This exhibition celebrates trades, job opportunities, progress, and territorial expansions. At the turn of the century, drawing on the exhibits and materials owned by geographical and commercial societies, missionary orders, and army corps, several colonial museums were born. The Museo della Società Africana d'Italia in Naples, the Museo Agrario Tropicale in Florence, Museo Guglielmo Massaia in Frascati, and so on. The establishment of such museums was meant to showcase the colonies throughout Italy. Collections from the overseas territories of Italy appeared in many museums, including some unlikely places. Small rural Italian villages each presented their own different version of the colonial empire. Although not part of the case studies I will elaborate on, it is interesting to note that many of these collections revolve not only around the interest in African peoples, but around their environment, the flora and fauna, and especially its resources, botanical, mining, plant and agricultural resources, and so on. Here is just an example from the Tropical Museum of the Istituto Agronomico per l'Oltremare, displaying cotton samples as a means of encouraging Italian entrepreneurship in the colony. Scholar Catherine Yusuf, for example, examined how the grammar of geology is foundational to establishing the extractive economies of subjective life and the earth under colonialism and slavery. Yusuf argues that race is established as an effect of power within the language of geology's objects, the extracting of human and inhuman resources from territory as property. Modern museums have often been called, with good reason, secular temples, exhibiting and praising the economic development, imperial domination and nationalism, the religions that transformed Europe in 19th and 20th century. Going to the museum became, just like taking part in a cult, a regular outgoing for school children, cultivated townfolks, enjoying leisure time, social climbers aspiring to gentility, countrymen on an excursion. Imperial powers bid with one another for prestige through this competitive and high-catching display, where the so-called primitive was used as a backdrop against which national progress could be gauged. Colonialism, in fact, was not only about soldiers and cannons, but also about ideas, about forms, about images and imaginings. For a child or an uneducated resident of the suburbs that would never had the chance to experience the empire otherwise, some specimen from Africa or Asia was the tangible proof of the supremacy of his race and culture over another. Since the artifact of specimens collected in museums were once those of the others, there is an implicit relation in the construction of a museum which may be defined as a relation of power. The expropriation, not only in an abstract etymological sense, but sometimes in the dirty sense of theft or pillage of objects or animals or plants or minerals from actors in a particular context of space, time, and meaning, and their appropriation by observers in another. Such exhibitions may also be seen as laboratories of museology, combining a framework for celebrating, indeed glorifying colonialism with a visual apprenticeship for the working classes who had been recently admitted to museums. It is the so-called regime of representation that provided the public in a very immediate and tactical and physical way the culture necessary for the participatory remaking of history, of memory, of identities. What emerges from this reflection is the malleability and plasticity of the objects and specimens on display. Stuffed animals organized in dioramas, samples of minerals, seeds, and foodstuffs, Objects of common use, clothes and jewelry, and commodities were considered, I quote, raw material that are only worth what we do to them. Tools of a new art of government based, as Laperrière said, and I quote again, on the right disposition of things arranged to lead to a convenient end. The convenient end was, of course, to show the supremacy of the white European man and his generosity in taking care of such so-called primitive people. And also to testify how colonialism would raise the living standards of European families, and at the same time, the possibility it offered to enrich the pockets of the industrialist factory owner. I will now analyze the colonial collection of the oldest museum of anthropology and ethnology in Italy, the Museum of Florence. To frame conceptually the visual analysis, I would refer to Stephen Foster and Graham Huggan, according to whom the exotic functions dialectically as a symbolic system, domesticating the foreigner for the metropolitan audience. As such, it is a discursive space that creates and controls the culturally different by providing forms of cultural translation to help define metropolitan identities. The exotic signifier, that is the visual sign which composes a given representation of the other space, changes its meaning according to diverse political formats, as well as cultural imperatives. This means that the same image may assume different social connotation in different contexts of reception. Indeed, the Florentine Museum and its collection have had many lives, and its collection have been perceived differently through time. The museum was founded in 1869 by Paolo Mantegazza in Florence, where the same year he also established Italy's and the world's first cathedra, university professorship of anthropology. He also founded the Italian Society of Anthropology and Ethnology in 1870 and its journal Archivio per l'Antropologia e l'Etnologia the year after. Mantegazza had trained as a doctor, but was also a politician, anthropologist, photographer, and sought to develop a unified so-called science of man, with a broad definition of the new discipline that brought together human physiological, ethnographic, and comparative psychology collections with his new anthropology museum. Later complemented by a companion psychological museum. Mantegazza's vision of anthropology as a balanced synthesis of humanism and science led him to address the physical element of the new science based on his understanding of the rural Italian regional societies. This view also affected his understanding of what an ethnographic museum should be, whose inclusive nature in Mantegazza's view should embrace a physical organization, and I quote, "I would love to see a whole museum of ethnography organized according to the physical order of the objects, and not the ethnographic one. And surely the same objects exhibited in a different manner would speak differently to our minds," end of quote. At first, Mantegazza then set up about obtaining non-Western ethnological materials from the Medici collection, as you can see in the screen, from Captain James Cook's third voyage and from other. Among the scientific collection later acquired were those collected in East Africa by Carlo Piaggia, in New Guinea by Luigi Maria d'Albertis and Edoardo Beccari, and around the world by the young Enrico Giglioli and Giglioli's mentor Filippo De Filippi. Regarding the Italian colonies, there were many Europeans campaigning expeditions in Somalia starting from the mid-19th century. The activity of Italian travelers intensified around 1888, the year in which the Oblio and Majeerteen sultanates became Italian protectorates. This period saw Antonio Cecchi's exploration of the coast at the mouth of the Giubba River in 1885, and the expedition of Robecchi Birchetti in 1891 and Vittorio Bottego in 1892-1895. Ugo Ferrandi and Eugenio Ruspoli, both in 1893. Particularly revealing about the Italian occupation of East Africa is a small but significant collection from the battlefield of Agordat, the second battle of 1893, on the border between Eritrea and Sudan. After the bloody battle that saw the Italian victorious over the so-called dervishes, Peleo Bacci, former civil commissioner of the Italian government in Keren, collected what remained of the ground. Some battle flags, coats, weapons, armors, and all the equipment of the cavalrymen, which he later donated to the Florentine Museum. At the beginning of the 20th century, the journalists took on the precise aim of scientific research and surveys, which characterized the missions promoted by government and research agencies. Following the Eritrea mission, the museum's ethnographic collection were enriched by a large number of objects representing Eritrean people. The Eritrea mission was the first scientific expedition in the colonies subsidized by the Ministry of Education in 1905 and 1906, and carried out by 4 scholars: the anthropologist Aldobrandino Mochi, the ethnologist Lamberto Loria, the geologist Giotto Dainelli, and the geographer Olinto Marinelli. The 4 were already in Eritrea to attend the first Italian Colonial Congress at Asmara that took place in 1905. And from Asmara, they started their journey across the colony. It was also the occasion to field test the instruction for the study of the Eritrean colony, developed by the Anthropology Society and the Society of Geographical and Colonial Studies, later published in 1907. This was Mochi's only journey outside of Italy. In fact, Mantegazza's right-hand man was a desk-bound scholar, theoretician, and museographer. The Italian Ministry of Education founded the expedition to Eritrea to conduct field research on the customs and traditions of the Sao nomadic people, Muslim nomadic shepherds of the Assa-Orta Plateau, as well to create ethnic, geographical, and geological maps of the entire territory. Therefore, the rich collection brought back to Florence has particular museological value, since it's an example of a collection designed to be exhibited in a museum, consisting of objects chosen by expert ethnoanthropologists to provide a documentary representation of the visited people. A fact, as we shall see, that it's extremely rare in Italian colonial museology. Each people was shown as a matter of fact for what the Italians wanted to believe it was. As we all know, in many cases, the invention of ethnic and tribal identities is purely colonial, but I will use the categories of the Florentine Museum, categories that the Florentine Museum used with the aim of demonstrating how they were functional to a colonial discourse in the museum. Regarding Sao shepherds, various types of furnishing and tools were collected, including woven plant items, containers made from hollowed gourds, water carrier, trays, tableware, and milk containers. In contrast, several large, heavy clay pots to store grain were collected to document the farmers' sedentary people. The specimen also included a large plough used to furrow rocky soils. The Dankali, or Afar people, presented as extremely belligerent and responsible for the death of some Italian explorer in the colony, were represented by curved gill daggers, armed daggers, round shield. Curiosities, let's say, include salt bricks, very valuable and used as a trade currency, implying therefore that the Afars were not familiar with the use of money, considered by the Europeans one of the signs of civilization. The spiritual life of the Amara people was documented by some vestments and instruments of Coptic Christian priests, along with incense burners and parts of the gospel on parchment and other ceremonial objects. A large group of objects documented the Amara woman's personal care and ornaments, such as the leather bags, necklace, bracelet, forehead bands, and so on. From the Amara people come also silver jewelry of the, let's say, higher social classes, glass plates from the less advantageous one, as well as bracelet, razors, and henna containers. The full cloth and leather horses tell us that the Amaras rode horses, a peculiarity that, according to the museum, is not found for any other people, and which is once again, according to the Italians, a sign of the superiority of the Coptic Amaras over other peoples in the region. In the Amara section, there are also wooden and leather musical instruments, strings and percussion, ceremonial weapons, carved and round shields adorned with silver plates, evidently for the Italians possessed by dignitaries. While some scientists at the time believed that the other, non-European, lived in an immutable present, historical dimension different from ours, from which it couldn't escape, at the same time, some of them were feeling that the contact with the cultures of the colonial dominators, technologically more advanced, but also morally superior, they believed, threatened to put an end to the eternal habits of the primitive population. Eterni fanciulli, as Landucci highlights, erasing their customs and material culture, and hence the need to preserve their cultures into museums. Surprisingly enough, the collection was beginning to be studied only in the 1930s, after the invasion of Ethiopia. And I think here the provocative words by George Stocking echoes in everyone's mind. I quote, "In a context where at least 90% of museum ethnological specimens had probably never been studied at all, the question could be seriously posed. Does anthropology need museums?" End of quote. Transcription of Moki travel diaries, in which dates and location are meticulously noted, allowed a complete reconstruction of the history of the collection and even the reason for the choices of collected items. And again, only recently, the diary has been published for the first time by the museum's curators. The photo archives also conserves around 8,000 photographs taken during the trip, as well as the anthropometric forms of the many individuals that were measured at the time, for whom a genealogical reconstruction was carried out. The completeness of the documentation demonstrates the accuracy of the entire mission, which also gave rise, as I said before, to publish instructions, guidelines for research, although there is no evidence that they were actually ever used afterwards. From this point of view, the methodology used is interesting for historical analysis of anthropological research in the early years of the 20th century. And the collection actually became a reference point for the knowledge of the region at the time. The museum at the time also hosted the materials collected by Ferdinando Martini, the first civil governor of Eritrea at the time of Convegno Coloniale di Asmara, curious observer of the custom of the people subjected to the Italian colonial rule. Some more expeditions in Somalia were later conducted in 1930, 1924, and 1935. The first was led by entomologist Guido Pauli and the geologist Giuseppe Stefanini, while the next two saw the emergence of Nello Puccioni, anthropologist, ethnologist, student of Aldobrandino Mochi, and director of the museum from 1931 to 1937. The ethnographic collection from Somalia are organized once again in groups: hunters, fishermen, settlers, or semi-nomadic farmers. The death of Mantegazza from the death of Mantegazza until World War II, the contribution of the colonies to the collection consisted mainly of specimens from Somalia and Libya, and the collections of Lidio Cipriani. Lidio Cipriani was a Florentine anthropologist, teacher, and explorer who went to Africa at least 7 times, producing over 250 facial plaster casts. The original white plaster casts were then painted according to the color of the skin of the subject using Volution color scale. By the way, we talk about plaster cast during a very interesting KNIR colloquium called plaster face cast and the heritage of colonialism and racial science a few weeks ago. On the right side, you can see a quite problematic, in my opinion, new arrangement of part of the plaster cast collection of the Florentine Museum. A committed fascist, Cipriani was one of the authors of the Manifesto of Race, published in 1938 in Il Giornale d'Italia. He began working at the Russell office and contributing to Telesio Interlandis journal La Difesa della Razza, almost from its inception. But I will not go into further analysis of the role of Cipriani, who was to become director of the Florentine Museum in relation to fascist racial policies. I would like to talk instead about another museum, which I think is more indicative as an example of the change condition under the advent of fascism. I know that Valeria De Plano is far more competent on the subject than I am. Will in a few weeks' time be looking more closely at the transition from colonial in the liberal era to fascist colonialism. I'm going to introduce you to a much lesser known collection than the one in Florence, a provincial museum run by a woman and openly with no scientific purpose, but in my opinion, extremely important. This collection clearly shows that an idea of Africa actually arrived in the Italian suburbs. Not the Africa of the 19th century ethnographers, but a new imagery capable of mixing elements of the most classic exotism with details linked to the creation of a patriotic identity. The museum, located in Verona, one of the empire's most rural provinces, is the Maria Fioroni Colonial Museum of Leniago. Distinct from the scientific tone of the Florentine Museum, let's say scientific, of course, this museum is relevant for several reasons, not last because its founder and curator was a woman. Maria, daughter of Enrico Fioroni, a convicted patriot who had fought alongside Garibaldi in the Battle of Bezzecca, Maria had the opportunity to study and cultivate a multiplicity of interests, including archaeology, ceramics, and history. She volunteered for the Red Cross during the First World War and kept close correspondence with the fighters. Over 7,000 letters preserved in the archives of the Fioroni Foundation attest this bond. Maria carried out her intense and multi-phased research in the large family palace, which from the early 1930s, she slowly turned into a museum dedicated to the history of Leniago, showcasing the archaeological materials and the military and Risorgimento relics she had collected. Between 1939 and 1941, to complement the domestic collections dedicated to the history of Verona, the noble family home also housed a room containing the Colonial Museum, set up by Fioroni herself, who at the time was an active supporter of the regime colonial policy, to the point of holding the position of provincial trustee of the Fascist Institute of Italian Africa. Thus, the museum was described by a journalist in 1942, and I quote, "One of the most curious museums that we have ever seen. Never had a museum offer so much hospitality to zoology, natural science, mineralogy, numismatic, history, chronicle, seated in a single provincial Olympus, causing an almost Babelic mixture of curiosities." Fioroni, also the secretary of the female branch of the Fascia di Leniago, firmly believed in the civilizing mission of the Italian troops engaged on the Ethiopian front, and had a terrible fascination for idealized, distant, and mysterious Africa in the mode of classical Orientalism. The arched room of her Colonial Museum, for example, distinguished by the Moorish style from those of the rest of the building, were designed to reproduce, and I quote, "the arches of the Alhambra in Seville, perhaps the best calling card of the sumptuous Arab civilization," end of quote, which, however, had very little to do with the civilization of the Horn of Africa. Nevertheless, we can imagine the astonishment that this type of architecture could arouse in the population of the small Veronese town, where perhaps few inhabitants would have questioned the fanciful transposition of Moorish Spain centuries gone onto modern East Africa. Leniago's populace were certainly impressed by the stuffed lions, panoplies, drums, shields, and jewels that belonged to Ethiopian brass and queens, whose names had become so familiar as they had occupied the pages of Italian newspapers for years. The Gazzettino of November 1937 wrote that, and I quote, Africa cannot be loved without knowing her and cannot be known without loving her. The Leniago Museum will lead that love, which is so necessary, for without it a people would not really be able to become a good colonizer. End of quote. While a provincial museum, it was not a parochial one. Another reporter wrote that it was, and I quote, at the forefront of the colonial movement, a museum that it is admired by many, and that is also known in Rome for the organic nature of its collections, considered among the most complete existing. The commodities collection from various places of the empire are arranged in good order and with precision. There is the first heat harvest by our settling Gondar, various types of coffee from Jimma, cotton from Arrar, Kaffa, the Somali cotton from Genale, and that from Tessanei, sesame, coconut, tobacco, madreporic products of the Red Sea, skins of various animal, minerals, end of quote. While the display of commodities was not unusual, some colonial museums were created for this specific purpose, such as the aforementioned Tropical Museum of the Istituto Agronomico per l'Oltremare. In a context of this kind, it suggests a more emotional and personal aspect. It was a matter of convincing, through the exposition of the richness of the colonies, the population of a small town in the Veneto province, but crucially, one of the largest labor pools Fascism drew on for its operation in the Horn of Africa, as well as for agricultural colonization of Libya, that the sacrifice of their loved ones or themselves in the colonial wars of fascism was a valuable and noble enterprise which served the imperial cause of the nation. I quote, "The photo of Beozzo, fallen in East Africa, in the fulfillment of his duty. Next to the portrait, a medal he wore and a flag donated by his father. A bloody dagger striking our attention belonged, says Miss Maria, who is accompanying us in the visit, to Rossini Angelo, who died in East Africa and was decorated with a Cross of Merit by Ministry of Italian Africa." The museum sought to strategically provoke emotions in its public, as the objects showcase represented not only individual lives, but something greater: race, civilization, empire, progress, history. The museum then introduced another central theme in the narrative of the Italian colonialism and beyond, the big game hunting. Maria exhibits her father's and brother's big game hunting trophies. Images and narratives about the untamable and dangerous flora and fauna, big game hunting, and safari played a crucial role as tools of empire administration, as well as in the diffusion of a biased knowledge of the colonial world. As put by Jeffrey Richards, and I quote, "For ordinary people, the empire was the mythic landscape of romance and adventure. Most people were not bothered about the actual condition in the empire. It was the imagery which they absorbed and endorsed, and the imagery was romantic, adventurous, and exotic." As far as the Italian case is concerned, much remains to be done regarding the study of practices aimed at creating an ethnographic and natural imagery, aimed not only at making Italian citizens aware of their colonial subjects and territories, but also ultimately at creating possibilities for tourism. Although the narratives of safari and wildlife tourism has often been ignored as one modern result of colonialism, as Stuart Hall writes in The West and the Rest, the identity of the Western world was created in part to contrast with the new worlds Europeans were discovering. Colonialism provided both visual and narrative informations on the African colonies. Many museums expanded their collections during the second Ethiopian campaign. Oh. Ne manca uno. Okay, one is missing. I'm sorry. Anyway, it was a picture of the Guglielmo Massaia Museum in Frascati, established in 1909, that became the Ethiopian Museum in 1935. So once again, we see the impact of the second Ethiopian campaign on museum. The museum enriched its collection, until then related almost exclusively to the Cardinal Massaia, with weapons, shield, and various objects of Ethiopian craftsmanship. I think it's pretty clear how, in contrast to the grand overreaching empire and Roman narrative of fascism, it is more correct to think of a dialogue between peripheries, those of the empire and those of the motherland, which were united by a continuous flow of materials and peoples. Therefore, while fascism failed in its attempt to centralize colonial museology, it succeeded in bringing the colonies closer to the Italian provinces, making sure that the imperial and racist ideas penetrated deep into the consciousness of the Italians to remain there well beyond the fall of the fascist regime. Finally, we come to the last part of my presentation, dedicated to the museums of today and the challenges of the present. In the past few years, museums across the US, Europe, and Australia are trying to tackle the challenges of decolonizing their institution. However, the very meaning of decolonizing is being debated. As far as the Italian case is concerned, the most emblematic example is the former Colonial Museum in Rome. Building on the controversial announcement of the rearrangement of the former Colonial Museum in Rome with the new name Museo Italo-Africano e le Alpi, I will make an attempt to frame the Italian case in the broader ongoing debate on restitution, redefinitions, and rethinkings of colonial collection. Only one museum in Italy overtly bore the name Museo Coloniale, Colonial Museum, and it was founded in 1923 by Benito Mussolini. As prime minister, he nursed aspiration to transform Italy into an empire echoing the glories of ancient Rome, and viewed the National Museum as a means of affirming the position of Italy as a colonial power. The Colonial Museum was partially modeled on the Belgian Congo Museum in Tervuren and other European institutions, such as the Trocadero Museum in Paris. Indeed, much like the Belgian and French museums, it was created following an exhibition. On May 23, 1914, the Esposizione Internazionale di Marina di Genere Marinara Mostra Coloniale Italiana was inaugurated in Genoa in the presence of the Italian royal family. It was the first time that an exhibition title included the word coloniale. Here, the space reserved for the colonies was unprecedented. Perfect reconstruction of the fortresses and mosques in their actual dimension were erected, and in the space in front of the pavilions, Turkish cannon were placed. The spoils of the war in Libya, which had just ended. Artifacts from different, sorry, I don't find it, okay, I have to go back. Artifacts from different colonial populations were presented and compared as evidence to support ethnographic consideration on the people who produced them, reflecting on the possibilities of their becoming civilized and attempting to create a sort of social evolutionary ranking within the colonies themselves. Libyan colonies were present for the first occasion as the flagship of the Italian nation overseas. Libya was believed to have been the seat of an ancient and powerful civilization, as testified by the find brought to light by the Italian archaeological missions, an aspect that would be used as an instrument of propaganda later by the National Fascist Party. The Genoese exhibition, which provided to be a great popular success, coincided with the outbreak of the First World War, which saw the suspension of all types of exhibitions, the almost complete loss of the Libyan colony, and the neglect of Eritrea and Somalia, Italy's two other African colonies. While the outbreak of the war, with the outbreak of the war, the collection of artifacts were transferred to Rome, where they were stored in some disorder in various warehouses until 1923, during which period they suffered alteration and damage. Finally, the Colonial Museum was set up in Palazzo della Consulta, and Umberto Giglio, an official of the Ministry of the Colonies, was appointed its first director. The inauguration of the museum took place on the 11th of November 1923 at the presence of numerous prominent figures, including the Ministry of Education Giovanni Gentile, Mussolini himself, and the King of Italy. The Fascist Party wanted a museum that would serve to convey its policy of prestige and power, especially since in the aftermath of the war and the peace agreements that were signed, Italy's reputation abroad did not correspond to the image that the regime wished to give of itself. Italians themselves took little interest in their country's African colonies at the time, as the Minister of Colonies Federzoni noted during his speech at the inauguration of the Colonial Museum. The museum, therefore, had an arduous task, that it was to awaken the colonial pride of the Italians. At the time of its opening, the museum consisted of 20 rooms, each dedicated to a different country or region. The rooms were divided into sections in which the different categories of exhibits were arranged. In the first section were reproduction of archaeological artifacts and ancient statues. In the second, photographs, painting, maps, graphics, movies, and films. In the third, specimens of raw material, wood, marine sponge, ivory, minerals, and leathers, and artifacts. But not so much the handcrafts of the colonial subjects, but I quote, the products of industriousness of some entrepreneurs who have successfully established a distillery in Tripoli and confectionery factories in Eritrea. And in the fourth section of the museum, ethnographic collection. Despite the intention, rather than imitating an educational display like in the Trocadero in Paris or the Congo Museum in Belgium, the random assemblage of objects in the Museo Coloniale was reminiscent of the Cabinet de Curiosité, with its everyday object pertaining to the indigenous cultures, animal skins, trophies, and taxidermic specimens, pieces of mineral and finished products processed in Italy, European weapons, medals, and commemorative coins, diaries, and memorabilia belonging to famous soldiers. Moreover, it should be kept in mind that the museum staff did not possess any particular qualification, and the collector consisted mostly of soldiers and government officials. The museum was moved in 1932 to a new location next to the Zoological Garden and the Civic Museum of Zoology in Via Aldobrandi, thus drawing an explicit connection with the exotic fauna of the colony, a location in which Giglio hoped a new complex could rise with, I quote, a modern aquarium, a pavilion of Italian and colonial timbers, a small museum of geology, and one of mineralogy. In this way, the museum could offer Italians, I quote again, information for a calm judging and balanced evaluation of the possibility of a greater commitment by Italy to its colonial interests, given its serious problem in sourcing raw materials and in the immigration of Italians beyond the narrow limits of the peninsula. At the time, the museum consisted in about 11,000 objects and specimens, almost all of them exhibited in crowded rooms in arrangements that were still quite messy. To begin, the labeling failed to convey information about the objects, often because no information had been gathered, as it confirmed by the museum's inventories and the lack of an archive specifically dedicated to the collection. The display of African fauna, perceived as dangerous and aggressive, was used to impress the public and to stress the savage characteristic of the African continent, thereby enhancing the heroism of those who face these perils without fear. The rooms were full of animal trophies and collections ranging from stamps to ethnographic objects and paintings. The main focus, however, undoubtedly lay in the many documents and photographs of the so-called pioneers, Italians who courageously traveled the African continent before the establishment of the first Eritrean colony. Men whom the fascist government was eager to celebrate, in contrast to the previous liberal governments that were opposed to the expansion of Italy overseas and were in their eyes lukewarm or even fearful of a deeper involvement in Africa. Considerable space was set aside for displays glorifying the Italian army and the greater colonial battles. The blood-stained uniform of Marshal Rodolfo Graziani, a prominent officer who served Fascist Italy interests in Libya and Ethiopia during the 1920s and 1930s, had been wearing during the assassination attempt made against him in Addis Ababa, was proudly showcased. The Museo Coloniale, renamed Museo dell'Impero d'Italia, was inaugurated a third time in 1937. The reasons for this reorganization are unknown, but I would hypothesize that the arrival of new specimens and objects from the Ethiopian campaign necessitated a restructuring of the display. And we know for sure that a room was reserved for the cannons recovered in Adwa. A few weeks later, however, the museum closed again, perhaps in order to continue the reorganization work. And it would be closed for exactly 10 years until 1947. The museum reopened in 1947 and dragged on until 1970 with fewer and fewer staff and a gradual closure of the rooms. I'm sorry, I don't know why the text is so little in this slide, but anyway. After World War II, a discussion on disposition of the former Italian colonies in Africa happened at the UN. Italy wanted to keep at least the pre-fascist colonies. In the picture, you can see a visit to the Colonial Museum by Undersecretary Brusasca, while at the United Nations, the memorandum on the Italian colonies drew up on behalf of the Italian government by Ambassador Giulio Cora and Ethiopian Enrico Cerulli was under discussion. After its closure in 1971, the collection went then dispersed to various institutes, dismantled and stored in warehouse for 50 years before being brought together starting from 2012 in the Museo delle Civiltà at the Euro district. The area that you can see here, the area of Rome, which in Mussolini's mind had to materialize the fascist revolution by celebrating its 20th anniversary. On the 25th of May 2020, a press conference dedicated to the rearrangement of the former Colonial Museum in Rome took place virtually due to the COVID pandemic. The reopening of the museum that during the conference was planned to happen this year is now postponed. During the press conference, the most comprehensive official documentation to date, the name of the museum was presented. The dedication of the museum to the Italian reporter Ilaria Alpi, killed in Somalia in 1994, and the choice to rename the Colonial Museum as Museo Italo-Africano, Italian African Museum, was presented. I feel that the name Italo-Africano reminds a rather generic historical connection, and not explicitly mentioning the colonial phase and the distinctive Eurocentric posture which informed the museum and the colonial museology at large. In this context, and in light of the problematic and partially unacknowledged results of colonial legacies in Italian society, the inherently problematic nature of such cultural and material heritage seemed to remain hidden. The dedication to Ilaria Alpi also appeared to be a misstep. Although the reporter was involved in journalistic investigations about socially engaged themes, such as waste and arms trafficking between Italy and Somalia, naming the former Colonial Museum after an Italian personality leaves for the umpteenth time the former colonial countries in the background, an exotic set in which white Europeans move. One then wonders whether it is appropriate to refer so heavily to the ancient Roman tradition. During the first few minutes of the press conference, which you can find on YouTube, the director of the MUCIV recalled an anecdote linked to Cato and the figs of Carthage to underline the closeness between the North African shores and Rome, especially when it has been used as one of the main keys to justifying, as we've seen, fascist imperialism in Libya. In the last few months, actually, the creators of the Museo delle Civiltà are rethinking both names and the concept first presented with the online press conference. Although the date of the complete rearrangement of the museum has been postponed until a later date, a first showcase has been set up a few weeks ago, and I visited this morning. Here are the pictures. The museum actually asks visitors what they think should be done with the collections, which are shown and not shown, wrapped in cellophane. This, on the other end, is an artwork by artist Delio Giassè called Facciamo conto di vedere le pantere, se no che Africa è. On exhibit as part of the exhibition L'Inarchiviabile at the Goethe Institute Rome right now, we can see how the artist has included some of the museum's objects, shoes and a coat from the collection dedicated to the raw materials and Italian manufacturing, and an adorned shield owned by an Ethiopian Ras, and his reflection on Italian colonialism. In this case, the museum opened its storehouse to the artist, allowing him to work with some of the objects. The curators recently said that that's the kind of intervention that they want to promote for now instead of a permanent exhibition. I think my time is up, and I wanted to thank you for your attention. I would like to say that a continuous work in progress for me. And yeah, thanks again, and I look forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you very much, Beatrice, for your rich and inspiring lecture. I'm sure there are a lot of questions, so let's open immediately the discussion, and also people following us online can join us with questions. So you can write your questions in the chat, and we can start also the discussion here in the auditorium. So if there is any question among, or shall I start and break the ice? Yeah, oh yes, there is a question. I'm sorry, I didn't.
Thank you.
Can you say your name, please?
Sorry?
Can you say your name, please? So we know.
My name is Pasquale Di Maio. I would like to know where, if the Colonial Museum in Florence is open nowadays or not. Thank you.
Yes, it is. They're working actually right now on the rearrangement of some of the colonial rooms. So some of them might be closed at the moment, but they're working on them, and the rest of the museum is open to this.
Other questions? Yes, please. Angelo, here in front.
Thank you, Beatrice. That was excellent. I just wanted to know, I was really fascinated with the last artwork that you showed, and I just thought, are you going to, in the future, maybe engage with more contemporary art? And how do you see that sort of in dialogue with your aims of your research?
That's something I know nothing about for the moment. And I'm trying to keep up with everything that's been happening, and contemporary art, it's now a big part of the activity of colonial museums. So I'm trying to learn something, but I'm very ignorant about this at the moment. So yeah, I think it's very interesting, the fact that they're thinking about residencies for artists and activists. I think it's more interesting that what they said before at this press conference, virtual press conference. And I think it's a better choice to take some more time to reflect on these issues before thinking of some permanent exhibition. So, and yeah, I'm going to keep myself busy trying to learn something more about all of this. I mean, I see that there is a question.
Yes, there are more than one.
Okay, I'll take my time to read it. I'm sorry.
we can also ask the person to, Jorge Antonio Luis Lamia.
Yeah.
You could
also, so many questions.
Yes,
there are a lot of
questions, so it's nice.
Yeah, Emilia Diaz, you can see it, right? Okay, but it's in Italian, but I think maybe you can understand the question. Anyway, the first one, it's about the Emilia Diaz theorization of what's colonial. And I think that's a very first big important question. I feel that sometimes, especially in Italy, we are thinking about decolonizing, but before that, there isn't, much scholarship about colonial museums. So maybe sometimes if I feel that we are thinking about decolonizing collections that we don't even know at all, like the colonial collections in Rome, it's very difficult to actually have any certain information about it, because there was no archive of the museum, and we have very few documents about it. So I feel that it certainly needs to be researched much more. And the question, what is colonial? It's very hard, but it's something that we have. It's very difficult to say what's colonial and what's not. So if the object or a specimen exhibited, or the hand of who got it, if it's the colonizer, right? So it's the colonial hand that makes the object colonial. So I think that's a very tough question to begin with. And the second question, yeah, the decision of the Amsterdam Museum to stop using Golden Age in the museum. That's not something that has been happening in Italy. I was at the Pigorini Museum, that it's part of the Museo delle Civiltà this morning, and they're still using phrases like the discovery of African art. And discovery, it's not even, let's say, it's just like as it is. There is no explanation. It's just the title of the section is the discovery of African art. And I know that before the word African, they were using, another word, and that's a very recent change that they've made. So we are quite far from this in Italy, definitely. And the third question, that's definitely another important issue. So in Italy, we are re-exhibiting colonial collections, and in other parts of the world, they're like being taken away, and there has been a debate going on about restitution. Today I asked the curators if they got any requests for restitution, and they actually told me no, not for now. So for now, the former Italian colonies hasn't been asking to get back some of the objects, even if we have some requests that are dating to the 50s. So in the 50s, Libya, for example, asked for the eyeglasses of Omar al-Mukhtar to be given back. And as far as we know, no one ever answered those letters that the Ministry of Colonies got. So there had been in the past, not at the moment. They told me not for now, but yeah, that's it. And there is another question about the exhibition of the Museo Africano. It's the picture that I show. Yes, I can maybe put it on again, just to be clear. This one, it's at the Goethe Institute in Rome. That's a temporary exhibition. And this one, it's the one at the Museo Africano. For now, it will be up until spring, they told me, May, possibly. So that's there with the panels are both in Italian and English, and they're posing questions to the visitors.
Thank you, Beatrice. I don't know if there are other questions from also the people here in the auditorium. Yes. Maybe I can ask you, can you say something more on the collection after 1947? Because I think it's quite important period. So after the war, look at situation, Italy, the position of Italy in front of the colonies. What happened with the museum exactly?
So as we've seen, the Colonial Museum was open and actually reopened in 1947, which I think it's another interesting thing to note, because it's the time when Italy actually loses the possession of the colonies. And Italy is in 1948 officially a republic. And so we have a Republican government that reopens a museum, and it actually uses it to demonstrate the civilizing work of the Italian was good, that the former colonies still need the lavoro italiano. It's a slogan, no? The Italian labor. So I think that's another very interesting and peculiar thing of the Italian case. This fact that they opened back the museum, and it was open till the 1970s. It was more and more forgotten, let's say. Starting from the 50s, we have very few accounts on the museum. We know that few people retired and they never hired new officials. And then the Ministry of Colonies closes, and so that's why even the museum eventually closes. But it goes on for quite a long time, in my opinion, with the name Museo Africano in the end. So that's another reason why I wouldn't call the new museum Museo Italo-Africano, because at some point that was basically the name of the former Colonial Museum.
Thank you. Other question? Yes, Niccolo.
Grazie. I have a curiosity. Maybe it's not very relevant to what you did in the thesis, but I'm curious whether you have studied or you have seen or you are planning to include maybe your research also the missionary museums, and if you have seen interesting correspondences or differences or these sort of things.
Yes, I am. I'm sorry, I don't know why the slide wasn't there. I'm pretty sure I put it in my PowerPoint, but it was a picture of the Ethiopian Museum in Frascati. But that's not the only one I'm taking into consideration. So missionary museums are very interesting. They kind of depart a little bit from this kind of narration. That it's what I wanted to present you today was much more related to the nation building of the Italian state. But there are some connections, definitely. It's interesting to note how even the missionary museums changed with the advent of the empire and how they participate in it. So that's very interesting. It's interesting to note also that at the beginning of the Italian expansion in the colonies, actually there was no good relationship between the church and the state. So at first, part of the clergy was against it. And it's interesting to see what's the evolution of this posture. And the interest in the empire that even the missionaries finally have, and how they would present their diaries, for example, the diaries of this Missionario della Consolata was used by Graziani invading Ethiopia from the south, because this missionary actually traveled in those regions. So that's very interesting. Thank you for the question, and I know that Gloria has been working on the subject too for Canada, for the Canada case studies.
There are two more questions, and maybe we can ask Julia to speaker to ask the question directly. Maybe it's nice. If you, yes, thanks.
Yes, of course. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for this talk. It was very interesting to see, this whole sort of like historical context. But it got me thinking a lot about current issues, which of course, like you ended with, like the question now of decolonization. And I was wondering how sort of you see this connection between these like knowledge structures that were sort of like sedimented during colonialism and like racisms in the present in Italy, and also within like these discussions happening in museums, of course, about decolonization. And then perhaps like a separate question, I was just wondering more in general, like if you know of any other sort of like artistic interventions coming from contemporary artists or activists. So like interventions posed to these colonial museums. Thanks.
Thank you for the question. So what the MUCIV did and is doing, it's actually quite a first time, let's say, for Italy. There is another, like they're basically moving on like together, but they're not, like there is no involvement of the one with the other. It's the MUDEC. I know that this acronym sounds all the same. Maybe I can write it down if you wanted to check it out. That's MUDEC, Museo delle Culture. It's in Milan. Okay, it's in Milan. They now have a room dedicated to contemporary African artists. But the thing is that the MUDEC doesn't have colonial, like let's say, objects from the former Italian colonies. So it's more of a, they have more of like Peruvian and South American collections. Of course, there is an Eurocentric and colonial posture even there, of course. But I didn't include them in my survey, and I'm not studying their collection, so I cannot tell you more about this. I'm very sorry, but you can definitely check out the website if you're interested, and you will find, I know that they have a room for contemporary art right now. There are a museo, let's say, ethnographic museum, basically. And there is another question.
Yes, we can ask Arendt to pose his question. Yes.
I hope you can hear me clearly.
Can you speak a bit loudly, maybe?
Can you hear me clearly, like this? Well, thank you for your fascinating presentation. I wanted to ask you something about curating colonial or ethnological museums in the present. You briefly showed an image of the display of the plaster cast from Florence, which struck me, and which you also briefly referred to as problematic. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on your view of this display, and in a more general sense, how could plaster casts be curated critically? Do you think of an instance in which this has happened successfully?
I can put on the picture back, so maybe I can be more clear in my explanation. Okay, so no, sorry, I have to find it again. Okay, so here you have la diversità è un valore, diverso come te, which translate like diversity is a value, diverse as you are, something like this, which I'm not sure about, like not sure what they mean. And you have the casts and you have the pictures. And they're all, not all of them are by Lidio Cipriani, some others are by Elio Modigliani, but ethnographers and anthropologists from the 19th and 20th century. The pictures are too connected, but not like related each one to the other. There is like, to me, there is no sufficient context to all of this. And then you have the three mirrors, which are actually like Luna Park mirrors. So those images are distorted, and I don't get it. Like, why? I'm looking at this and I will see my face kind of like in a Luna Park mirror, and I'm not sure what idea. I mean, I know what idea they try to convey, okay? And of course, it's like the intentions are good, but I don't really get it. So I think that's an effort. I'm not even sure that this cast should be on exhibit at all. That's something that maybe we should consider. And what they did, just to, okay, you cannot see it, but here there are some cuts, but they're in cellophane, because they're still thinking about whether or not to show them. So that's how they did for this temporary exhibition. So I think that's an easy way. I mean, it's an easy fix, but at the same time, it shows a reflection of that I mean, I appreciate, but that's my position on this.
I think there is another question. Yeah. Lori Calv-Cosmo, I saw her question in the chat. Maybe we can go back to the...
Yeah, the connection with the EUR complex is another interesting thing to take into consideration. There is also the name MUCIV, Museo delle Civiltà. We'll just tap it down so that you have it here. MUCIV, Museo delle Civiltà. Where's A? Okay. And you have Palazzo della Civiltà Italiana, which probably you know what I mean. It's the so-called Colosseo Quadrato, okay? And it's very close. They actually look at each other. And you can look at on the internet. I cannot see if it's Italiana. Okay. And they're very close to each other. The name, it kind of recalls this Colosseo Quadrato. And the Colosseo Quadrato, it's where the famous inscription, un popolo di viaggiatori, trasmigratori, poeti, it's where it is. And so I think that's the name of the MUCIV, which is like the big museum that houses all the small museum, Museo Pigorini, Museo delle Arti e Tradizioni Popolari, Museo Italo-Africano, even that one is a problematic name. And it's a problem that they open it anyway in the same place where it was intended to be. Yeah, definitely. But the Colonial Museum only got there 10 years ago. So it's not the history of the Colonial Museum, it's not related to the EUR complex. So that's even more unfortunate that they bought it there, in my opinion, at some point. Because the histories of these two, the museum and the building, are not related in any other way.
I don't know. I don't see any other question in the chat. I think we are running out of time. Is time maybe for the last question, if there is a last question? No, then we thank Beatrice Falcucci for this inspiring lecture. I'm sure we are all eager to learn more about your research. And thank you again. And
thank you.
And thank you to all of you for being here, and to the many who are following us online. Before closing this session, maybe I can say something about our next activities. Next week, we will have the keynote lecture of Professor Hinley, Constructing the Limes. That's a really nice occasion to be together in the auditorium for such impressive guests, I would say. And of course, we have a new KNIR research dialogue on December the 1st with Valeria De Plano. She's a leading scholar in Italian colonialism. So we will have the opportunity to continue the discussion on colonial identity and Italian national belonging. And on the same day, after the KNIR research dialogue, we will also have the screening of an Italian documentary film on colonialism, Hidden Pages, by Sabrina Varani. So it will be a great opportunity to reflect on colonialism from different points of view. And for now, I can maybe invite everyone to look our website and maybe to subscribe to our newsletter. So you will keep updated about our program. And now I think for those who are lucky here in the auditorium, we will have maybe a drink and we say hello to all the group at home. See you next time. Arrivederci.